Okay, we're going to pick back up in our February chapter. I'm going to start back where you were supposed to read and analyze from page 144 through 149 for leopard time so that we can kind of talk about that piece a little bit. But before that, make sure that you, number one, have your notes out for the February chapter. If you have not started notes, then you know that on notebook paper, we just write the chapter title, and underneath that, we try to gather some notes about the most important main ideas, especially things that have a to be continued feel about them, and things that really help develop what's going on with Holling and his conflicts and his relationships with different characters. So, before page 144, some of the things that you should have written down, obviously it's February. February is the month that Valentine's Day is in. And Valentine's Day with these seventh graders is becoming kind of a big deal. Holling decides that he's going to ask Merril Lee, and he actually kind of catches himself by surprise because he asks her if she'll do something with him on Valentine's Day, and even she thinks at first that maybe he's joking, but he's serious. And then he realizes a problem that Holling has frequently is he doesn't have that much money. He has like $3.80 something cents and isn't quite sure what he can do with Merril Lee on Valentine's Day with that amount of money. His sister kind of tells him, well, she'll figure out you're a cheapskate soon enough, so she can just decide if she's going to like you or not. And when Mrs. Baker hears that he's taking Merril Lee out, she talks to him about the fact that the theater company is now putting on Romeo and Juliet. He and Mrs. Baker have just read Romeo and Juliet, and Holling was not a big fan. He kind of thinks that Romeo and Juliet are dumb and that Romeo's a big jerk, and that the things that happen at the end of Romeo and Juliet are totally unrealistic. And however, Merril Lee thinks it's so romantic. And in an interesting turn of events, when Holling goes to pick up the Valentine's cupcakes from Miss Biggio for his class that she's baked for everyone in the school, she gives him an envelope with 2 free tickets to Romeo and Juliet on Valentine's evening, and tells him that those are her season tickets and he might as well use them because she will not be. So she actually does something, Miss Biggio does something kind for Holling. So we're kind of picking up after they've gone to the Shakespeare play, and this is on Merril Lee and Holling's date on Valentine's, but we're kind of tracking some things like figurative language and character conflicts. So I'm going to go over those things as we read this part, and then I'll finish the chapter. Are you going to play a part in another Shakespeare play? Merril Lee asked. I thought of her sobbing at the end of Romeo and Juliet. Of course, I said. That wasn't even a Presbyterian lie. It was a flat-out lie. But after doing the balcony scene with Merril Lee, I wasn't going to tell her what a jerk Romeo was, and how the only way I was going back onto the festival theater stage was, well, there wasn't anyway. Merril Lee looked at her watch. My father will be here soon, she said. I hope he remembers. I sipped my Coke. I hoped he forgot. All he does is work on the model for the new junior high school. He goes over and over it. He moves a pillar here, then another one there. It's not classical enough, he says. It needs to look like the Capitol building. Classical. Then Merril Lee imitated her father. Her eyes got large and her hands went up, and she spoke low. She should be on the festival theater stage. Classical, 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 said Merril Lee. There's hardly another word that comes out of his mouth. My dad doesn't have any pillars, I said. He's got his model all modern. Modern? I nodded. No pillars, no straight walls, so much glass that they'll need 3 Mr. Vendilaries to keep it all clean. That kind of modern. I asked the guy behind the counter for his pencil. He hesitated a second, since I guess he wasn't so sure about us, but he handed it over and made me promise to give it back. And then I drew the glass domes over the main lobby and gym and the science and art classrooms and the curved corners and walls and the clusters of classrooms looking out into sunlit space all over my white paper placemat. No one's ever come up with that concept for a junior high school before, I said. Merril Lee stared at my drawing and then went back to sipping her Coke. Her hair is auburn. Did I tell you that? In the lights of Woolworth's, it shimmered. So here's some text evidence that Holling isn't just hanging out with Merril Lee. It seems like he's starting to, if not already, liking her more than a friend. You might want to put that in your notes. Mr. Kowalski did remember to come. We finished our Cokes, and I handed back the pencil to the guy behind the counter, and Merril Lee took my placemat as a souvenir. And we walked to the car, hand in hand. Mr. Kowalski dropped me off at my house, and I wasn't sure, sitting in the back seat, how to say goodbye to Merril Lee, but she saved the day. "'Tis almost morning," she said. "I would have thee gone." "Sleep dwell upon thine eyes," I said. I didn't have to look at Mr. Kowalski to know that his eyes were rolling in his head. So that's a little bit of figurative language. His eyes weren't probably completely rolling around all over his head. So that is kind of a hyperbole or a metaphor. So that was Valentine's Day. The following week, the school board met to decide on the model for the new junior high school, which was probably why Mr. Kowalski had been spending all his time muttering, "Classical, classical, classical." The meeting was to be at 4 o'clock in the high school administration building. Mr. Kowalski would present his plan and model, and then my father would present his plan and model, and then the school board would meet in private session to decide whether Kowalski and Associates or Hoodhood and Associates would be the architect for the new junior high. I knew all of this because my father was making me come. It was time I started to learn the business, he said. I needed to see firsthand how competitive bidding worked. I needed to experience architectural presentations. I needed to see architecture as the blood sport that it truly was. There's some more figurative language there because architecture, designing buildings, is not literally a blood sport. So this is a metaphor for it being something highly competitive. There's really not blood involved. Which makes architecture sound like a profession that Macbeth could have done pretty well in. The meeting was in the public conference room, and when I got there after school, the school board members were all sitting at the head table, studying the folders with architectural bids. Mr. Kowalski and my father were sitting at 2 of the high school desks, which made the whole thing seem a little weirder than it needed to be. In front of them was a long table with the 2 models for the new junior high school, each one covered with a white sheet, like they were some sort of national secret. I sat behind my father. There was a whole lot of preliminary agenda stuff, and old business, and procedural decisions, and all that. My father sat through it coolly, occasionally looking at his watch or squaring the edges of his presentation notes. Mr. Kowalski was more nervous. I'm not sure that his cigarette was out of his mouth for more than 3 seconds at a time. "Mr. Kowalski, we're ready for your presentation now," said Mr. Bradbrook, who was the chairman of the school board. He sat at the head of the table, sort of like God would sit if God wore a suit. So we have sort of like God would sit if God wore a suit. That's a simile. He was smoking too, but he wasn't working at it as hard as Mr. Kowalski was. "You have 8 minutes," he said. Mr. Kowalski picked up his presentation notes and angled out of his seat. He went up to the table with the models and stood there for a moment. Then he turned and looked no, not my father, at me. Really. My father looked at him, and then he turned and looked at me like I should know what was going on. But I didn't. I just shrugged. 7 minutes, said Mr. Bradbrook. Mr. Kowalski cleared his throat. Twice. He looked at his design papers. He cleared his throat again. Then he looked back at me once more and began. "Gentlemen," he said, Though this is irregular, I have made some significant design changes for the interior of the new junior high since my original submission. In fact, the entire concept has changed markedly, so the plans that you studied for this afternoon's presentation have also changed. I have copies of the new interior plans and ask the board's patience as I show you the concept. This may take slightly longer than the allotted time, but I am sure that the Chamber of Commerce businessmen of 1967 won't begrudge Kowalski and Associates a few extra minutes in order to clarify the proposal and to promote the general business atmosphere of the town. This is irregular, said Mr. Bradbrook. Has the new concept affected the cost estimates? Not significantly, said Mr. Kowalski. Mr. Bradbrook considered. Well, he said, if Mr. Hoodhood will agree, then I see nothing wrong with your presentation going slightly longer. Mr. Hoodhood? What could the Chamber of Commerce businessmen of 1967 do? He shrugged and nodded, but the back of his neck grew as red as boiling sin, and I knew he did begrudge the extra time. He begrudged it a whole lot. Mr. Kowalski pulled off the sheet from his model of the new junior high school. He cleared his throat again. As you can see, gentlemen, said Mr. Kowalski, the design is quite classical in the best traditions of our national architecture for a time when our children desperately need to be reminded of our great American traditions. And it was. It looked like the Capitol in Washington, D.C. Wide steps swooped up past a line of pillars and up to the central doors. Above that rose a steep dome with thin windows cut all around. On either side of the dome, the building spread graceful wings, all with thin windows again, and behind the long gymnasium formed the tail, whose rows of bright windows faced south and north to let in as much light as any gymnasium could ever have. But we live in 1968, gentlemen, Mr. Kowalski said. Just as our children need to be reminded of our great traditions, so too do they need to enjoy the advantages of contemporary technology. I think you'll find the new interior design both modern and innovative, a perfect blend of where we have been and where we're going as a nation. He handed out copies of the plans for the new design to all the school board members, keeping his back to my father and me the whole time. Then he took us all through the new interior, slowly. No pillars, no straight walls. The roof, a series of glass plates above the science and art rooms. The central dome, 3 stories high, over the main lobby, and clusters of classrooms all looking out into the sunlit space, all as modern as can be. I couldn't believe that anyone has ever come up with this blended concept for a junior high school before, said Mr. Kowalski. Then he sat back down. He did not look over at us. Instead, he lit another cigarette and began pulling at it. He shuffled all of his papers into a folder. The school board was astounded. 3 of them applauded. Not Mr. Bradbrook, since God doesn't applaud. My father turned and looked at me again. His face was very red, and I could tell he was fighting for some kind of control. Halling, there's something you should have told me, isn't there? He whispered slowly. I looked at him. Do you think this is a game? This is the future of Hoodhood and Associates. Everything rides on this. My future and your future. So what did you do? He used the kind of voice that in my family means that a voice a whole lot louder is about to come along in a minute or two, so you had better start preparing. But let me tell you, I didn't really care all that much about what he would say or how loudly he would say it. I really didn't, because suddenly I knew something a whole lot worse. Romeo was a genius compared to me. I hadn't seen at all what Merril Lee was doing on Valentine's Day while we were sipping Cokes at the lunch counter at Woolworth's. I hadn't realized how easily she had gotten what she wanted from me, my father's design for the new junior high. Run me on the dashing rocks and hand me a vial of poison. I'm such a jerk. I'd probably drink it. I'm a bigger jerk even than Mickey Mantle. I got up before I began to bawl like a first grader. Bawl like a first grader is a simile. Halling, warned my father, a slightly louder, slow whisper. I left the conference room. My red father never did tell me what he did for his presentation, Probably it began with him demanding to see Mr. Kowalski's plans and then suggesting that he took these from Hoodhood and Associates, not saying it outright, but just suggesting it, like he knew it was the truth but wouldn't say it, and then arguing that Mr. Kowalski should withdraw his proposal because it wasn't the same one he had submitted, and that's not how honest businessmen worked. It would have been something like that, with him getting redder and redder all the time. I bet if you were watching it, you sure would have seen that architecture is a blood sport, and Macbeth couldn't have played it any bloodier than my father. So here we have examples of conflict building between three different groups of people, or three different people at least. We have evidence that Merril Lee took the drawing that Halling did on Valentine's Day that was kind of an example of what his father was planning to submit, and shared it with her father. So now we've got conflict between Merril Lee and Halling because Halling feels like he's been used and manipulated by her. We've got conflict between Mr. Hoodhood and Halling because his dad knows that the only way that Merril Lee's father could have known so much detail about his plans was from Halling. And we've got conflict between Mr. Hoodhood and Mr. Kowalski because there is something dishonest going on between the architectural firms. So there's three different layers of conflict introduced on those pages. Moving on. February is a can't decide what it wants to be month on Long Island. What's left of any snow is melted into brown slush and runs in dirty ridges alongside the street gutters. The grass is dank and dark. Everything is damp, as if the whole island had been dipped under the dark water and is only starting to dry out. Mornings are always gray and cold. That's what it was like between Merril Lee and me the next day at school. Slushy, damp, dirty, dark, gray, and cold. We didn't look at each other. At lunch, we ate about as far away from each other as we could, and she went outside early, even though Merril Lee hardly ever went outside. She didn't come to chorus, so I sang the soprano part for Mrs. Violet of the Very Spiky Heels alone at our stand. When Mrs. Baker asked if I'd like to partner with Merril Lee on the sentence diagramming exercise in the afternoon, I told her I'd rather do it with Doug Switek. On Friday, things were still slushy, damp, dirty, dark, and cold. Merril Lee wore sunglasses to school, even though it was gray like always. When Mrs. Baker asked her to remove them for class, she said that her doctor had asked her to keep them on, that she was supposed to keep them on for maybe the rest of the school year. I was the only one in class who didn't laugh at that. I looked out the window. For the next Wednesday, I wrote an essay for Mrs. Baker about what Shakespeare wanted to express about being a human, being in Romeo and Juliet. Here is the first sentence in my essay. What Shakespeare wanted to express about being a human, being in Romeo and Juliet, is that you better be careful who you trust. Here's the last sentence. If Romeo had never met Juliet, he would have been all right. But because he was star-crossed, he did meet her, and because she came up with all sorts of plans that she didn't bother telling him about, he ended up taking poison and dying, which is an important lesson for us to learn in life. I had Merril Lee to thank for this, you know. If she hadn't done what she did, I never would have figured out what Shakespeare was trying to express in Romeo and Juliet about what it means to be a human being. When I handed the essay in, Mrs. Baker read it through twice. So, she said slowly, do you think Juliet was right to stab herself at the end of the play? Yes, I said. I see, she said, and she put the essay in a manila folder and left it on top of her desk. But unlike Juliet, Merril Lee didn't stab herself. In fact, that afternoon she was waiting for me outside the gates of Camellia Junior High, standing beside a ridge of crusted snow that she had stamped down flat. It wasn't my fault, she said. Aren't you supposed to be at St. Albert's? I just showed him your drawing because it was so good. I didn't know he would use the same design. Sure, Merril Lee. It's true, she said. All right, it's true, whatever you say, Merril Lee. You told him everything about my father's design, everything, and then a few days later he draws up new plans so that the inside of his school is just like the inside of my father's school. You had nothing to do with it." "I didn't say I had nothing to do with it," said Merril Lee. "I said I didn't know he would use the same design." "I'd keep the dark glasses on, Merril Lee. It's easier to lie to someone if they can't see your eyes." A long moment went by, then Merril Lee took off the glasses and threw them past my head. I think she was trying to throw them at my head. Then she turned and walked away, but not before I saw why she'd been wearing them. I picked up the glasses and put them in my pocket. That night, I saw those glasses flying past my head again and again and again, and I saw Merril Lee's red eyes again and again and again. Merril Lee wasn't in school the next day. I kept looking over at her empty desk. At lunch recess, I wrote a new Romeo and Juliet essay in the library. Here was the first sentence of the essay. What Shakespeare wanted to express about being a human in Romeo and Juliet is that it's hard to care about two things at the same time, like caring about the Montague family and caring about Juliet too. Here was the last sentence. If Romeo had never met Juliet, maybe they both would have still been alive, but what would they have been alive for is the question that Shakespeare wants us to answer. I handed the essay in to Mrs. Baker at the end of the day. She read it through, twice. Then she took my old essay out of the manila folder, which was still on top of her desk, and put in the new essay. She dropped the old essay into the trash and put the folder with the new essay into her desk, and then she looked up at me. "So, what will you do now?" she said. That night, with 79 cents left over from Valentine's Day and $1 from Monday's allowance, I bought 2 Cokes and a rose with a ribbon. I took them over to Merril Lee's house and rang the doorbell. Mr. Kowalski answered it. "You're the Hood boy," he said. "Is Merril Lee home?" I said. He opened the door further and I came in. He hesitated. Then, "Her room is the one at the top of the stairs," he said. I went up the stairs slowly. I felt his eyes on my back, but I didn't want to turn around to let him know that I felt his eyes on my back. I knocked at Merril Lee's door. "Go away," she said. I knocked again. I heard her chair scrape against the floor and her footsteps stomping across the room. Her door opened. "I told you." Then she stopped. Her mouth was open. "I thought you might be thirsty," I said. Her mouth was still open. Am I what? Thirsty?" She looked at the Cokes in my hand. "Yes," she said. I handed her a bottle and pulled the opener out of my pocket. I love the sound of a brand new Coke bottle when you pry the lid off and it starts to fizz. Whenever I hear that sound, I think of roses and of sitting together with someone you care about, and of Romeo and Juliet waking up somewhere and saying to each other, "Weren't we jerks?" And then having all that be over. That's what I think of when I hear the sound of a brand new bottle of Coke being opened. On Thursday, before the school board met to decide on its new architect, Kowalski and Associates withdrew its bid for the new junior high school. Hood and Associates was given the contract. "What chumps," said my father. "They were going to win hands down. What chumps." He shook his head. "They're bound to go under now, but if you can't play for keeps, you shouldn't be in the business in the first place. And Kowalski never could play for keeps, and Hood and Associates can." He rubbed his hands together like Shylock on stage. And that's when something changed. I suddenly wondered if my father was really like Shylock. Not because he loved ducats, but because maybe he had become the person that everyone expected him to become. I wondered if he had ever had a choice, or if he had ever felt trapped, or if he had ever imagined a different life. With this new contract, he was a sure bet for the Chamber of Commerce businessmen of 1968. It was probably what everyone expected. For the first time, I wondered if it was what he wanted, or if there was a time when he might have wanted something else, or if I wanted something else, or if we were both only fortune's fools, like Romeo. Merril Lee and I were partners on Friday for sentence diagramming. We ate together at lunch, and we decided to be partners for Mr. Petrelli's next geography assignment, which was on the California Gold Rush and you. "Make it relevant," said Mr. Petrelli. We sang together in chorus for Mrs. Violet and of the Very Spiky Heels, and when it came time at the end of the day to clean the board, we did that together too. And that's why we were at the board together when Mr. Goreshi came into the classroom to give Mrs. Baker a yellow telegram, a telegram that She took out of the envelope and then read and then dropped onto the floor as she rushed out, leaving Mr. Goreshi standing in front of the class without any idea what to do. When we picked up the telegram to put on her desk, Merril Lee and I could hardly not read it ourselves, or at least the words that mattered. Downed helicopter, transport, stop. Kassan, stop. Lieutenant T. Baker, missing in action, stop. All right, that's the end of our chapter February. I want you to make notes on how Halling felt about Merril Lee and how and why the way he felt at first when he clearly felt betrayed. How did that change? What changed his mind about that Merril Lee had just betrayed him on purpose? And I also want you to take notes about how he's feeling about his father now. He's given us new details about what he wonders and thinks about his father. And then obviously this very ending information at the end of the chapter about Miss Baker's husband should be in your notes as well. Once you're finished with the notes for this chapter, then you should head on to our Google Classroom so that you can use this chapter to make a prediction. There's a prediction assignment for you there.